Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's video, we will be looking at a serial killer from Wales who struck terror into Welsh communities that are far better known for their safety, beautiful beaches, lakes and mountains. This case today looks at a perpetrator who, due to his trademark black shirt and tie, became known as the Man in Black. To begin today, we return to North Wales in the 1990s. In late September 1995, the police were called to the home of a 56-year-old retired railway man, Henry Roberts. Henry, who was somewhat of a loner, lived in a remote farmhouse in Cwgaliog on the island of Anglesey. His body had been discovered face down on the driveway of his home. The post-mortem would reveal that Henry had been brutally stabbed to death with what was thought to be a 5-inch long household knife. He endured 13 stab wounds to his back and a further 14 to his front. When his body was found, Henry's trousers had been pulled down and there was a stab wound on each of his buttocks. However, there was no evidence that he had been sexually assaulted. A team of around 60 police officers and forensic experts were brought in to work on the case and examine the scene. An extensive search of the area was carried out, including police divers searching the stream near Henry's house, but the murder weapon could not be found. Not too much was known about Henry. He generally kept to himself, possibly because he was homosexual at a time when there was very little acceptance of this. He had no family in the area, so the police were unable to determine whether anything had been taken from the house, and a clear motive for the murder could not be established. By early October, the police had built a picture of Henry's whereabouts on the days leading up to his death. He was last seen on Tuesday the 26th of September, standing in the doorway of his home. Around this time and in the days that followed, some vehicles were seen at his house, most notably a small white car which had been parked in his driveway. The police were keen to trace the owner of this car, and on the 4th of October 1995, a 21-year-old man was arrested in Pontypridd in connection with Henry's murder. It would appear that the case was well on its way to being solved, but after 71 hours in police custody, the man was released without charge. The investigation continued. However, in the time before CCTV and fewer technological advances in crime solving, the progress was slow. That November, there was another murder. On the morning of the 30th of November 1995, the body of 49-year-old Keith Randalls was discovered at the road resurfacing site in Anglesey where he had been working. He too had been brutally stabbed to death. Keith, who was from Bourton in Chester, worked alone as a night watchman and had been living in a caravan at the site for around 8 weeks. He was a divorced father and also a grandfather, and it was established that his daughter, Lisa, had a telephone conversation with him at around 9 p.m. on the evening before his body was found. She said that her father had been in good spirits and was looking forward to returning home for Christmas. Keith told her that he was planning on going out to get fish and chips for dinner. A man fitting Keith's description was seen at a fish and chip shop in the valley, which was a 15-minute drive away, between 9:15 and 9:45 that evening. Keith died from multiple stab wounds from a knife which was around 8 inches long and 1 inch wide. It was obvious that there had been a violent fight inside the caravan. It was in a state of disarray, with lots of blood on the floor. The first person who came across Keith's body pulled up his pants in an attempt to maintain his decency. There was no evidence of sexual assault. House-to-house inquiries in the Llangefni area followed, along with a fingertip search of the worksite. The police again identified a number of cars which they were anxious to trace, including a dark blue Ford Cortina type car, a red Escort XR3i, a Ford Transit van, and a white car which was possibly a Peugeot. Several items were missing from the caravan. The Vodafone mobile phone which was last used when Keith spoke to his daughter on the evening of the murder, a Mitsubishi video recorder for which the police had the model and serial number, and a Roberts radio. Keith's murder was investigated separately from Henry's, whilst acknowledging that both deaths may have been the work of the same killer. 6 men, aged between 17 and 31, were soon detained at Bangor and Holyhead police stations. After interview, they were all released without charge. On the 9th of December, it was reported that a 28-year-old man was being questioned in relation to Henry's death. Nigel Owens, a taxi driver from Holyhead, appeared in court on the 12th of December and was charged with Henry's murder. With it looking as though Henry's case was drawing to a close, the police in the community were shocked when, just over a week later, there was another killing. In December, the police received a missing persons report. Sheila Davies was becoming increasingly concerned after her husband, Anthony, known as Tony, had not returned home after visiting his aunt. Anthony was a 40-year-old father of 2 who had lived in Leesfan for his entire life. He was a happy and hard-working man who had worked in the local bakery for many years before becoming an assistant at Colony Bay Crematorium a few years earlier. It wasn't long before Tony's blue Ford Escort was found parked near the seawall at Pensarn Beach in Abigail. A short distance away, Tony's body was discovered near the edge of the waterline. He had been stabbed multiple times in a horrific attack. On the 20th of December, a press conference was held where Sheila pleaded for help in finding her husband's killer. Becoming too upset to talk, Tony's brother Michael stepped in asking for help, saying, "We want to ask the public to help as much as they can. Anthony did not deserve to die the way he did, so if anyone can help, please come forward." The area where Tony's body was found was known for being a rendezvous spot for homosexuals. Despite reports in the media at the time, there was no evidence to suggest that Tony was gay, something which the family have always said was not the case. However, the police worked on the theory that Tony had been engaging in homosexual activity at the time of his death and realised that they needed to enlist the help of the gay community. At that time, there was fear among many gay men of being outed as part of the gay community. This, together with mistrust of authorities who had been known to blame the victims of gay hate crimes on the person's alleged promiscuity, led to many victims staying quiet about any abuse or violence that they had endured. An anonymous hotline was set up and the police received multiple calls. One call of notable significance was from a man who said that he had been approached by someone dressed in black leather and was attacked and beaten at a house in Kinmel Bay. Whilst he did not give the address of the property, he provided a description of the house. Another caller told how a man driving a van had been particularly aggressive towards him. Whilst he could not provide a number plate, the man could describe an emblem on the side of the van. This emblem was the logo of a vehicle hire company in Denby. These 2 key pieces of information led the police to a man by the name of Peter Howard Moore. Peter was born in St Helens in Lancashire on the 19th of September 1946. He grew up in a large house in Kinmel Bay, Conwy, where his family ran the local hardware shop. His mother gave birth to Peter quite late in her life. She had not expected to have a child and was delighted when she finally fell pregnant with Peter. She spoiled him rotten. The pair had an extremely close relationship and he could do no wrong in her eyes. However, his relationship with his father was in complete contrast to this. He was a strict authoritarian who was aggressive, domineering and often drunk. When his father died in 1979, Peter took over the running of the family hardware shop and was a well-known and seemingly well-liked member of the local community. He was described as always having a smile on his face, being very polite, and generally a really nice man. He had fallen in love with the movies when he was a young boy, and when finances allowed, he began to buy and renovate small community cinemas all along the North Wales coast. This provided him with some limited press interest, and he liked to present himself as the saviour of cinema in his area. By 1995, he managed 4 cinemas: Bargilt, Holyhead, Kinmel Bay and Denbigh. In his role as projectionist in the cinemas, he would need to dress all in black. Peter was gay, but chose to hide his sexuality from his family, as he feared offending the mother who he adored. As time passed and after the death of his father, he had more freedom and confidence to have relationships with other men. He would go cruising for brief, anonymous sexual encounters. His mother died in 1994, and after this he became marginally less secretive about his sexuality, with some people beginning to think that he may be homosexual. Peter used a local legal firm to deal with the probate of his mother's estate, where he was thought of as being a well-spoken, quiet, calm man. An opinion that would have been severely questioned when Peter used this same legal firm a couple of years later for his criminal defence. Peter's house matched the description given to the anonymous tip line, and it was also discovered that he had rented a van from the company whose emblem had been described by the other caller. By the 22nd of December, the police were in a position to move forward. 2 teams were assembled with the plan to arrest Peter whilst he was in his house. As they arrived at his home, Darlington House, in Kinmel Bay, he was pulling off at the driveway in his car, and the police had no choice but to follow. He was pulled over and displayed no emotion as he was arrested. Local people were shocked, and many believed that the police must have made a mistake. Surely the kind man from the hardware store could not be a killer. Peter was initially charged with the murder of Tony Davies. He denied any involvement in the crime. As that interview came to a close, Peter was immediately re-arrested and charged with Keith Randall's murder. Peter again denied having anything to do with this crime. Then, in the early hours of Christmas Eve, he told the police that he was ready to make a statement. He went on to confess and provide details of each murder. Peter said he had spotted his first victim, Henry Roberts, walking back from the pub one evening. Peter pretended that his car had broken down and struck up a conversation with Henry. Both men had an interest in Nazi memorabilia. A few nights later, Peter returned to the area and made some noise outside the house to attract Henry's attention. When Henry came out to see what was going on, Peter stabbed him. Henry tried to run back to the house, but Peter walked behind him, constantly stabbing him in the back. When Henry eventually collapsed to the floor, Peter pulled down Henry's trousers and stabbed him in both buttocks. These stab wounds were inflicted post-mortem. Peter then went into the house and stole a swastika flag. At this point, the Holyhead taxi driver, who had been charged with Henry's murder, was still in custody. As Peter went on to divulge the details of his second victim, the interviewing officers were completely shocked. He told the police how he had met a man in a gay bar called Paco's in Liverpool in October that year. The man, Edward Carthy, asked Peter for a lift home. After Edward got into Peter's car, he fell asleep, and when he woke up he realised that he was in a forest, a long way away from his home. Edward tried to escape, but Peter caught up with him. According to Peter, Edward then asked him, "Are you one of these Nielsen types?" after serial killer Dennis Nielsen. Peter then stabbed Edward to death. The police had no knowledge of this murder up until Peter's confession. Peter provided them with a clear map detailing where he had left Edward's body. Edward's badly decomposed remains were discovered soon afterwards. He was identified by his dental records. 7 weeks after he failed to return home from a night out, his family were delivered the devastating news that Edward had been murdered. The third victim, Keith Randall's, was another purely opportunistic kill. Peter was very stressed about his financial difficulties and the fact that the bank were looking to foreclose on his business. Peter found that killing people was a stress release for him. So when he drove past the construction site and saw the lights on in Keith's caravan, he went to knock on the front door. When Keith answered, Peter plunged a knife into his stomach. A violent struggle followed, during which Keith was stabbed multiple times. Peter went on to provide details of his final victim. In December 1995, he went for a drive when he came upon Tony Davies. After a short conversation with Tony, Peter pulled out a knife and began repeatedly stabbing him. Tony fought back and Peter was also sliced with the knife, but eventually he overpowered Tony, who died on the beach from his stab wounds. After admitting to 4 murders, Peter then went on to admit numerous indecent assaults and violent assaults on men over the previous 20 years. When asked about his crimes, Peter was cold and had no emotion. "I don't feel any remorse whatsoever for what I have done." When questioned how he felt afterwards, he replied, "I was pleased. It was a job well done. It was fun," adding that there was a certain enjoyment in killing. The police did not only rely solely on Peter's confession, but built a comprehensive case of evidence against him. They determined that in order for Peter to be sexually satisfied, he needed to dominate the other party both psychologically and physically. As time went by, he needed to increase the level of violence to get the same amount of pleasure, and the murders began. A search of Peter's home revealed that every room, with the exception of his mother's bedroom that had remained untouched since the day she died, was geared towards S&M. Whilst he was known to dress in black in his role as a projectionist at the cinema, this had developed into an increased desire to dress like a Nazi soldier: black boots, a long leather coat, and leather trousers. The police also found bloodstains on the walls throughout the house, a jacket belonging to Tony, the video recorder linked to Keith's murder, and the swastika flag taken from Henry's house. Additionally, at the time of his arrest, the police found a knife in Peter's car that was later established to have Tony's blood on it. Despite all of the evidence against him and his full confession, on the 3rd of January 1996, Peter told the police that he had in fact made everything up and that he was an innocent bystander to the crimes. He went on to claim that the murders were committed by what turned out to be his imaginary gay lover, Jason, who he had named after the killer in the Friday the 13th films that he had often screened in his chain of cinemas. Peter continued this line of defence when the case went to trial, during which he behaved as though the proceedings were fun and entertaining to him. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 3.5 hours before finding Peter guilty of 4 counts of murder. In November 1996, he was sentenced to life in prison with the recommendation that he never be released, with the judge stating, "You were responsible for 4 sadistic murders. At no stage have you shown the slightest remorse or regret for the killings, nor for the 20 years of violence that preceded them. I consider you to be as dangerous a man as it is possible to find." His solicitor would later recall one part of Peter's confession which particularly stuck with him, stating that he told us how he spotted a man he wanted to kill while driving around Llangefni, but couldn't stop because of the one-way system. By the time he came back to the same spot, the man had gone. Firstly, I am astonished by the mind of a man who obeys a one-way sign but thinks nothing of murder, and secondly, that the man, whoever he was, will never know just how lucky he was. In April 2000, Peter was again in court, this time seeking damages from the people who he had left in charge of his house and possessions. 2 of his friends, Lee Bradshaw and Pauline Pryderch, were asked to act as caretakers to the property and were given permission to sell some of the items, but Peter had given them a list of things that he wanted to keep. Peter found out that the couple had taken everything from the house and had also stripped the building, including ripping out sinks and hardwood floors. He was awarded nearly £13,000 in damages for the loss of possessions ranging from items such as antique furniture and cinema posters to garden gnomes and cans of food. The following year, Peter again appeared in court, this time seeking £160,000 in damages from the North Wales Police, who he claimed had failed to protect his home following his arrest in 1995. This time the case was struck out on the basis that he had no realistic chance of winning at trial. In 2011, he challenged the fact that he was subject to a whole life order with the European Court of Human Rights due to such sentences being outlawed throughout Europe. Early the following year, it was announced that this appeal had failed. In 2013, it was announced that the European Court of Human Rights had ruled that there had to be a possibility of release and review to be compatible with human rights. Nevertheless, in February 2015, the court upheld the lawfulness of such whole life orders on the grounds that they would be reviewed in exceptional cases. Peter is now 77 years old and remains in prison. That concludes today's story. Please subscribe if you're new to the channel. Thank you for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. The 20 or so beatings that were mentioned in the story, the weapons of choice that Peter used were either a police truncheon or a wooden club. Goodbye.